Julia was the picture of quiet elegance. A literature professor, a devoted wife, the kind of woman who blended into the background at her husband's high-powered business dinners. But behind her calm eyes was a mind that noticed everything. For 5 long years she endured Nathan's condescension, his secrets, and worst of all, his betrayal. In a world where he believed she was too soft to matter, Julia was building a case, one silent observation at a time. The backdrop? A lavish anniversary dinner he orchestrated to celebrate his ego. The conflict? A marriage rooted in lies, deceit, and a forged prenup. The fallout? A public reckoning that would shatter reputations and trigger a federal investigation. But the real twist? Julia wasn't just exposing a man, she was setting herself free. Are you watching this story from home, from work, or somewhere in between? Tell us in the comments below, we want to know. The chandelier above shimmered like a halo of broken promises. Laughter danced across the private dining room of Harlow's, a high-end restaurant downtown, where a horseshoe-shaped table seated nearly 40 guests. Crystal flutes clinked. Silver cutlery glinted under soft, golden lights. And at the center curve of the table I sat next to my husband Nathan, exactly where he wanted me, seen but silent. He stood with the practiced confidence of a man used to owning the room, raising his glass. 5 years, he declared, his voice smooth and smug. 5 long years married to someone who thought Jane Austen was a financial advisor. The guests chuckled, some awkwardly, unsure whether to laugh or look away. I smiled faintly. Nathan wasn't done. They said marrying a quiet-lit professor was safe. Turns out it was just a 5-year investment in a gold-digging nobody. That line hit harder. The laughter died. My sister Claire shifted in her seat, visibly bristling. But I didn't flinch. I checked the time on my phone. 8:42 p.m. Right on schedule. I looked across the table and locked eyes with Nathan, who had already resumed his seat, pleased with his own cleverness. He had no idea the storm he had just toasted to. I didn't rise in fury. I didn't cry. I didn't storm out. I reached into the side drawer of the small table next to me and touched the edge of a manila folder. It was their proof truth strategy. My hands were steady, my heart calm. Because tonight wasn't a reaction. It was the finale of a plan that had taken root years ago, long before the first cruel joke, long before the first betrayal. I looked around at the polished faces, business partners to Nathan's right, a handful of my family members pushed to the far edges. Every guest had been curated for his image. Every detail of tonight had been orchestrated by him. Except one. Me. If you were one of the people at that dinner, you might have thought I was holding it together remarkably well. You might have said I was composed, graceful, even dignified. But the truth is simpler. I wasn't composed. I was ready. I had waited for this moment like a novelist waits for her final chapter to unfold. And when it did, I knew every beat, every twist, because I had written it myself. But to understand what brought me to this night, what made me smile through his insult and reach calmly for the folder, you need to go back 5 years. Back to the beginning of our marriage, when Nathan mistook my silence for stupidity and my kindness for weakness. That's when it all began. It wasn't always this way. In the early months, Nathan's condescension was subtle. A patronizing smile here. A simplified explanation there. You wouldn't get it, Julia, he'd say, sipping his coffee as I made eggs. Literature's cute, but this is real business. I laughed it off at first. But gradually, I began to realize that he genuinely believed I wasn't capable of understanding anything beyond fiction. That belief was his blind spot. And I became an expert at hiding the truth. I wasn't confused. I was observing. I watched the way he dismissed me in front of his colleagues, how he left sensitive financial documents out in plain sight, how he whispered details about questionable transactions while I folded laundry just a few feet away. It was during those quiet moments, those invisible hours of our marriage, that the real story began to take shape. I didn't confront him. I didn't argue. I watched. I memorized. And I started to build. I created a separate email address, one he didn't know about. I began forwarding photographs of spreadsheets, typing up summaries of overheard calls, and transcribing conversations he thought I wasn't listening to. At first I told myself it was just to prove a point, to remind myself I wasn't the airhead he made me out to be. But over time that habit became a strategy. Not revenge. Not yet. But a record. A weapon slowly forged. Nathan thought I was harmless. He thought I was tame. That was his mistake. What he never realized was that while he was busy playing the role of the clever businessman, I was playing the role of the clueless wife. And I played it well. Too well. Because when a man believes you're insignificant, he lets his guard down completely. That's what he did. And I took notes. Literally. For 5 years. But why now? Why tonight? What made this dinner, the one he so arrogantly organized, the night I chose to strike? The answer lies not in what he said during the toast, but in what I discovered 14 months ago on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. That was the moment everything shifted. That was the day the folder began to fill with not just spreadsheets and quotes, but betrayal with a name and a face. To understand how I went from tolerated spouse to architect of his downfall, you need to meet someone else. Someone who made the mistake of sending my husband a message he forgot to delete. Her name was Vanessa. And her text changed everything. It began at the breakfast table. Nathan was reading emails, half listening to me talk about a novel I was teaching that week. He sipped his coffee, smiled without looking up and said, "That's sweet, Jules. You've got your world and I've got mine." The implication was always clear. His world, business, numbers, deals, was real. Mine, with its paperbacks and lectures, was child's play. He meant no harm. Or maybe he did. Either way, I recognized the pattern early. He didn't think I understood him, so he stopped hiding things. It started with small things. Financial documents left out on the dining table. Calls with his accountant taken on speaker while I was tidying the living room. Conversations with business partners held in the open because I was just folding laundry or too busy thinking about her book club. I didn't interrupt. I didn't ask questions. I just listened. I smiled and nodded. I learned that when people assume you are not a threat, they become careless. And Nathan was no exception. At first it hurt. Being dismissed by the man I married felt like 1,000 tiny betrayals, stacked one on top of the other. I remember one evening about a year into our marriage, he was explaining a basic investment term to me, as if I were a child. I asked a question just to challenge him. His response was a laugh followed by, "It's cute that you're trying, babe." Something shifted that night. I stopped trying to be seen and started watching instead. I developed routines. A quick snap of my phone camera here, a voice memo there. I created a private email under a name even he didn't know. There I stored images of receipts, contract drafts, tax records, and the occasional out-of-context message that didn't sit right. I wrote down quotes from calls I overheard, time-stamped and labeled. I organized everything into folders. Nothing overt, nothing suspicious. At that point, I didn't even know what I would use it for. Maybe I just needed to know I wasn't crazy. That I wasn't invisible. That if everything ever exploded, I'd have proof that I had paid attention. And then there was the night he nearly caught me. I had opened a file cabinet in his office, looking for one specific document I'd seen him holding earlier that week. I didn't hear his footsteps until he was practically behind me. "Looking for something?" he asked. My heart stopped. But I turned, holding up a book he'd received as a birthday gift. "Just trying to remember who gave you this. I might borrow it." He looked at me, narrowed his eyes. Then he shrugged. "Pretty sure you won't finish it," he said. "Too much finance, not enough plot." He walked away. I exhaled. And smiled to myself. He hadn't just let his guard down. He didn't even think I knew what a guard was. That was the moment I realized the most powerful disguise I had was the one he had handed me. The image of the sweet, harmless wife. So I leaned into it. I let him believe it completely. When he made subtle jabs at my intelligence in front of friends, I played along. When he asked me to avoid certain rooms during Zoom calls with his partners, I stayed out of frame. Not because he told me to, but because I wanted him to believe I didn't care. The truth was I cared deeply. Not about his business, but about patterns. About lies. About inconsistencies. Literature had trained me for this. Every character flaw, every repeated phrase, every casual contradiction, those were narrative clues. And I collected them. Still, I didn't have a clear goal. Not then. I wasn't planning revenge. I wasn't even sure what I wanted. I just knew something wasn't right. And I refused to be blindsided. I watched his world spin on while he thought I wasn't watching at all. I watched him text with people he called clients, but spoke to like old friends. I noted the increasing frequency of documents marked confidential, left in plain view. I learned the names of people I'd never met, listened for shifts in his tone, flagged the documents that disappeared from his desk overnight. This wasn't paranoia. It was preparation. I had no idea what for. But instinct told me the mask I wore as his quiet little wife would someday become my shield. So I kept wearing it. And while he spoke over me at parties and smiled like a man in control, I built a fortress of details behind my silence. But what began as a habit of self-preservation transformed into something else the moment I opened his laptop on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. And there was one text, one name, one careless moment that turned quiet suspicion into undeniable truth. Her name was Vanessa, and the way he wrote about her made something inside me go still. It was a Tuesday, the kind of quiet, gray afternoon that made everything feel a little softer, a little slower. Nathan had just stepped into the shower. He left his laptop open on the kitchen island, like he always did when he didn't think twice about what I might see. I wasn't looking for anything. Not that day. I had planned to return a library book, maybe pick up some groceries. But then a notification popped up in the corner of the screen. A name I recognized. Vanessa Miller. I didn't move at first. Just stared at the preview. Last night was amazing. Can't wait to see you again when she visits her parents. My hands hesitated above the keyboard. I told myself to walk away. I didn't. I clicked. The message thread opened like a door I could never close again. There she was, Vanessa. The same woman who had wrapped me in warm hugs at family holidays. Who had complimented my dress at Nathan's sister's wedding. Who called me sister-in-law, with a smile that now made my skin crawl. The chat was long. Months of messages. Photos. Inside jokes. Hotel reservations. Shared calendars with overlapping initials. I scrolled further. She has no clue, Nathan had written. Still reading her little books while I handle the real world. I felt my throat tighten. But I didn't cry. I didn't slam the laptop shut. I took screenshots. Every message. Every image. I emailed them to my hidden account, checked that they were backed up, and then closed everything exactly the way he left it. By the time he walked into the kitchen, damp hair slicked back, asking if we had any more oat milk, I was already smiling. I think we're out, I said softly. My voice didn't shake. I had practiced that tone. That was the moment something shifted. Until then, my collection of data, photos of documents, recordings of shady conversations, notes from late-night business calls, had been about pride. About proving to myself that I wasn't as blind as Nathan thought I was. But after Vanessa, it became something else entirely. It became fuel. Evidence. Ammunition. And I was done being silent. 2 days later, I reached out to someone I hadn't spoken to in nearly a decade. Andrea Lewis. We went to college together. She had always been sharp, fiercely independent, and the last person to take nonsense from anyone. The kind of woman who wore tailored blazers before any of us knew what quarterly taxes were. She was now a well-known divorce attorney with a specialty in financial misconduct. I asked her to meet for coffee. I'm working on a novel, I told her over the phone. It involves a marriage, a fake prenup, maybe some light embezzlement. Thought you might be able to help with research. He didn't hesitate. Sure, she said. Let's catch up. When we met, I kept my tone breezy. I asked hypothetical questions. What if a character discovered her husband had altered a signed prenup? Would secretly recording conversations hold up in court? What's the statute of limitations on financial fraud if the spouse didn't know they were signing something fake? Andrea raised an eyebrow but didn't push. She answered everything thoroughly. I sipped my coffee and nodded like I was taking mental notes for a story. The truth was, I hadn't written fiction in years. After that, we met more often. I added details. Carefully. Fully. Still pretending it was all for a manuscript. Andrea didn't confront me. But her tone changed. Her questions sharpened. And one afternoon, when I handed her a typed transcript of a conversation Nathan had with a business partner about moving funds offshore, she closed her notebook and looked at me hard. If this is about your character, she said, voice low, she needs to be very careful. Some of what you've described goes beyond divorce territory. We're talking federal crimes. That was the line in the sand. And I crossed it without hesitation. I told her everything. The recordings. The fake prenup. The 5 years of slow, methodical deception I'd endured and recorded. Andrea didn't blink. She started organizing my files. told me which pieces of evidence would matter most in court, connected me with a forensic accountant, under the guise of helping with my storyline. And as the weeks passed, our meetings stopped pretending. They became war councils. Vanessa hadn't just exposed Nathan's affair. She exposed his assumption that I'd never fight back. That I would keep playing dumb. That I'd accept betrayal as quietly as I accepted being belittled. He was wrong. Because by the time Andrea had outlined our plan and the accountant uncovered tampering in the prenup, I had already decided on the battlefield. Nathan's arrogance made the decision for me. He was planning an anniversary dinner. 40 guests, black tie, gold-embossed invitations. A celebration of 5 years of success. 5 years of deception. 5 years of underestimating the one person who had never stopped watching. I knew exactly where the war would end. And exactly what I would bring to the table. The invitations arrived in thick cream-colored envelopes, stamped with gold foil lettering that read, 5 years of partnership and success, Nathan and Julia. The irony clung to every detail. Nathan had spent weeks planning the event, bragging about the guest list, the wine pairings, the venue. "It'll be perfect," he said one morning as he buttoned his shirt. "Just show up looking pretty." I smiled and said nothing. I had already ordered the dress. By then, my meetings with Andrea were no longer hypothetical. The forensic accountant had finished reviewing all of Nathan's business transactions I'd quietly collected. What he found was worse than we expected. Not just fraud. Not just tax evasion. But a deeply layered scheme involving shell companies, false invoices, and money funneled through charities that only existed on paper. And then came the twist we hadn't seen coming. The prenup. The document I had signed in good faith, scanned and filed on our wedding day, had been altered. Nathan had inserted a clause, after my signature, that removed my claim to nearly everything if we divorced. It was subtle. Just a few extra lines placed skillfully. The kind of adjustment someone might miss unless they were looking for it. But we were looking. And we had proof. The original, scanned on my father's office printer. Time-stamped. Untouched. Compared side by side with the final version Nathan had sent to his lawyer. Andrea leaned back in her chair when she saw them both, her jaw tight. "This isn't just unethical," she said. "It's criminal. This document alone can sink him." I should have felt anger. Instead, I felt cold resolve. For years, I had tried to justify his dismissiveness. I told myself I was imagining the condescension. I blamed myself for the emotional distance. But now it was all bare. The lies weren't mistakes. They were strategy. And now I had one of my own. Andrea and I built a timeline. She coached me on how to continue collecting without drawing attention. I bought 2 miniature recorders. One embedded in a fountain pen, another disguised as a USB charger. I started using specific language during casual conversations with Nathan, prompting him to elaborate on business deals. I asked about that company you mentioned in the Caymans. I pretended I was brainstorming characters for my novel. He laughed. "Don't worry about the boring stuff, babe," he'd say. And then he'd explain it all anyway. He loved the sound of his own brilliance. During this time I perfected my performance. The quiet wife. The dinner hostess. The woman who forgot to turn on the dishwasher but always had her hair brushed. At a charity gala, I introduced Andrea as my old college roommate, a tax attorney for a children's hospital. Nathan shook her hand with an indifferent smile, already looking over her shoulder at someone more important. That night, Andrea watched him with interest. "He really has no idea," she said to me as we left. "None," I replied. Meanwhile, our evidence pile grew. I stored files in multiple encrypted folders, 2 flash drives hidden in places Nathan would never look, and 1 locked safe deposit box. We listed every suspicious transfer, every forged document, every recording. We even mapped the phone locations to match his claimed travel dates with where he had actually been, often at Vanessa's apartment. Andrea called it airtight. I called it necessary. The night before the dinner, I laid out everything. My dress, dark navy and sleek. A shade Nathan had once called too conservative for a celebration. I chose it anyway. I slid Andrea's business card into my clutch, along with one of the flash drives and a slim manila folder. On my nightstand, I placed my phone face down. 1 tap would cue a scheduled message, set to send at 9 p.m. to every major guest on Nathan's contact list. The messages were already drafted, the attachments ready. All I had to do was show up. And I did. Right on time. I arrived at Harlow's 30 minutes early. The maitre d' greeted me with a wide smile. "Mrs. Coleman, welcome. The Magnolia Room is ready." I followed him past chandeliers and murmuring diners until we reached the private space. It was stunning, elegant and hollow. White roses lined the center of the table. Silver-rimmed plates sparkled under soft light. I walked the perimeter slowly, memorizing the seating arrangement. Nathan had clustered his business partners near him. My family was placed at the edges. Out of reach. Out of relevance. I slipped the folder into the side table drawer near my seat and texted Andrea. She confirmed. She would arrive precisely at 9. I sat quietly as the room began to fill. Nathan's parents entered first, followed by clients, coworkers, people I barely knew but had heard about for years. Nathan made his entrance last, laughing, confident, flanked by 2 of his senior partners. He scanned the room like a man preparing for applause. He looked at me, smiled, and kissed my cheek. "There's my beautiful wife," he said. "Always punctual. Always perfect." His hand lingered at my waist. "After dinner, Jeffrey will sign off on the Thompson restructuring. Big night." I nodded as if I didn't already know it was one of his more creative money laundering schemes. He returned to his seat, sipping wine. I crossed my legs slowly, folded my hands, and smiled at a passing waiter. Dinner began. So did the countdown. The room had settled into that comfortable lull between the main course and dessert. Glasses were half full, conversation flowed in polite waves, and the hum of soft string music filled the gaps. Nathan's laughter had grown louder with each glass of wine. His hand occasionally brushed my thigh beneath the table, a possessive gesture disguised as affection. Above it, he barely acknowledged me. Then Daniel, one of his partners, tapped his glass with a spoon. "I think it's time we heard a few words from the man of the hour," he said with a grin. The chatter faded. Chairs shifted as guests turned their attention to Nathan, who stood confidently, champagne flute in hand. "5 years ago," he began, "I made what many of you called the safest bet of my life." There were polite chuckles. "I married a quiet literature professor who preferred books to balance sheets. My colleagues told me it would be hard to be with someone so theoretical." His voice dipped into mock seriousness, drawing a few more laughs. "They warned me she might not understand my world. But I saw something else. A woman who wouldn't question my decisions, who would smile at the lifestyle I gave her and stay politely in her lane." The room shifted uneasily. A few guests laughed again, more uncertainly this time. My sister Claire clenched her napkin beneath the table. Even Nathan's mother was frowning. "And sure," Nathan added with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, "maybe I did spend 5 years married to someone more interested in fictional worlds than real ones. 5 years on a gold-digging nobody who, surprisingly, became my greatest asset." He raised his glass high. "To Julia. My lovely, harmless wife." A silence followed. Not the appreciative kind. The kind that crackles just before lightning strikes. I placed my napkin down carefully, stood and walked to the side table. Fully. Deliberately. All eyes followed me. I opened the drawer and removed the manila folder, turning back to the table with it in hand. Nathan raised his eyebrows, still riding the momentum of his moment. "What's this?" he asked, forcing a chuckle. "An anniversary gift?" "Oh, but it can't wait," I said, my voice clear and steady. "Funny you mention assets, Nathan. Because this folder contains the fake prenup you altered after I signed it. The one that, legally speaking, means you get nothing." The temperature in the room dropped. Nathan's smile faltered. He reached for the folder, flipping it open with a flicker of confusion that quickly turned to panic. Inside were 2 documents, the original and the altered version, annotated by a forensic expert. Highlighted. Dated. Certified. "And speaking of nothing," I continued, pulling my phone from my clutch, "those texts between you and Vanessa? The ones about hotel rooms, wine preferences, and how I don't suspect a thing? Those just went to everyone at this table." I tapped the screen once. Across the room, phones began chiming. One by one. Guests glanced at their screens. Some gasped. Others looked away in disbelief. Claire's mouth tightened. Nathan's mother went pale. His father stared at the table. "What the hell are you doing?" Nathan hissed, half standing. You're embarrassing yourself. No, I said softly. I'm embarrassing you. I'm doing exactly what you never expected. I paid attention. Nathan opened his mouth, but before he could speak, another voice joined the room. Perfect timing, I said without turning as footsteps echoed toward the table. Andrea entered the private room flanked by two colleagues in tailored suits. She carried a leather portfolio, her face calm and professional. Nathan stared at her like he had seen a ghost. You, he muttered. The tax attorney from the Children's Hospital Gala. Andrea nodded. Among other specialties, she replied smoothly. She placed the folder on the table in front of Nathan. These are the official divorce papers. And all supporting documents have already been submitted to the proper authorities. What is this? He growled. Some kind of stunt? Andrea didn't flinch. Mr. Coleman, this isn't theater. It's justice. And it's been a long time coming. Across the table, Daniel, Nathan's closest business partner, had moved several seats away. He now stared at the prenup copies, his face drained of color. Nathan, he said slowly, is this true? Did you actually forge legal documents? Nathan stammered. This is out of context. It's complicated. Not really, I said, watching him unravel. The texts have time stamps. The location data matches. And that Thompson account you were so proud of? That's already been flagged. Nathan reached for the folder, but one of Andrea's associates blocked his hand. Let's not make this worse, the man said coolly. The silence in the room deepened. Waiters stood frozen. The hum of music now felt surreal, a soundtrack to the unraveling of a man who thought himself untouchable. And I stood at the center of it, no longer the quiet wife, no longer the ignored woman in the corner. I stood for the first time entirely as myself. But even then I didn't realize how far this was about to go. Because what came next wasn't just about lies or marriage or betrayal. What came next was federal. The atmosphere inside the Magnolia room had shifted from uneasy to electric. The air felt dense, like the moment before a thunderstorm breaks. Nathan's eyes flicked from the divorce papers to the guests, most of whom were now glued to their phones, silently absorbing every sordid detail I had shared. His jaw clenched. His voice, usually smooth and commanding, cracked under the weight of disbelief. This is ridiculous, he muttered, trying to keep control. You don't understand what you're doing. Julia doesn't understand the first thing about business operations. Andrea opened her portfolio again. Then maybe you can explain this. She placed a printed transcript on the table. This is from February 12th, when you instructed your CFO to backdate invoices for the Thompson account. Or how about this email chain where you discuss hiding funds through the Westfield Foundation, which I believe only exists on paper? Nathan's color drained. You recorded me, he whispered. One-party consent is perfectly legal in this state, I said. Something you might have known if you'd ever paid attention when I mentioned I was researching a novel about financial crime. He shook his head slowly. You were writing about me? Not at first, I answered. But you became the perfect case study. I couldn't resist. Just then the doors to the private dining room opened. The restaurant manager entered, looking pale. He leaned slightly toward Andrea and whispered something into her ear. She nodded once, turned to me and said quietly, "It's time." And then they came in. 3 men in dark suits entered the room. They moved with purpose, their steps steady, their expressions unreadable. The lead agent, a silver-haired man with a firm gaze, scanned the room before speaking. "Nathan Coleman?" he asked, already locking eyes with my husband. Nathan didn't answer. He looked at me, at Andrea, at the guests who had now turned in stunned silence toward the newcomers. "I represent Mr. Coleman," said his lawyer Mitchell, who had rushed in minutes earlier, still slightly out of breath. "What's this about?" The agent held up a folded document. "We have a warrant for Nathan Coleman's arrest on charges of tax evasion, wire fraud, and falsification of federal records. Mr. Coleman, you have the right to remain silent." The Miranda warning rolled out calmly, professionally, like a script rehearsed 100 times. Nathan stood frozen. It wasn't until one of the agents moved to cuff him that he reacted. "This is a mistake," he snapped. "You don't know what you're doing. She set me up. My wife, she's twisting everything." The lead agent didn't even blink. The evidence Mrs. Coleman provided was remarkably thorough. In 20 years of investigating white-collar crime, I've rarely seen this level of detail. He turned to me. Mrs. Coleman, if we may, there are a few final details we'd like to confirm. I nodded, stepping closer, my voice even. The Davidson Shell Company was created in March, but the false invoices began after the Thompson restructuring in June. The original bank records are in the safe in his home office, behind the framed Matisse print. Combinations 27, 14, 36. Mitchell turned a shade paler. Nathan, don't say another word. But Nathan wasn't listening. He stared at me, a look of disbelief spreading across his face. All those times, he said, his voice low. All those evenings you were just sitting there, reading. All those nights I thought you didn't care. I was paying attention, I said. The agent stepped forward and cuffed his wrists. His hands, once so sure, now trembled slightly. As they turned to lead him toward the door, he paused, glancing back at me. Why here? He asked. Why now? Why not just let them arrest me at the office? I met his eyes without flinching. Because you needed to understand what you did. Not just the crimes. You needed to see what you did to me. This wasn't just about the law, Nathan. This was about being seen. The guests were silent. One of Nathan's partners, Jeffrey, stood and picked up his coat. I'm distancing myself from all of this, he muttered. Immediately. Others followed. Murmured excuses. Averted eyes. A network of powerful allies unraveling in real time. The dessert cart rolled quietly into the room. The server, unsure whether to proceed, hesitated. Andrea motioned him forward. Please. Don't stop on our account. A slice of chocolate soufflé was placed gently between two untouched glasses of wine. It deflated slightly in the center, like the illusion of control Nathan had clung to all these years. And then it hit me. Nathan wasn't the only one being unmasked tonight. I was too. But for the first time in years, it didn't scare me. It set me free. But there were still pieces of this story waiting to unfold. And not all of them would happen in this room. Some things, like betrayal, echo longer than a single night. As the agents escorted Nathan from the room, a strange quiet settled across the remaining guests. No one moved. No one reached for dessert. It was as if time itself had paused to absorb the weight of what had just occurred. My husband, no, my former husband, was now in handcuffs, facing a future he never imagined. And I was standing in the center of the life he built, watching it collapse like a house of glass. Mitchell, his attorney, pulled on his coat and followed after the agents, barking orders into his phone. The door swung shut behind them. And then the murmuring began. Hushed conversations. Stolen glances. Phones buzzing with questions no one was brave enough to ask aloud. Claire slid into the seat beside me. Her voice was quiet. I always knew he was arrogant, she said. But this, I never saw this coming. I took a sip of water. For the first time all evening my hand trembled. I hadn't noticed it until now. Claire reached over, gently covering mine. Why didn't you tell me? She asked. I looked at her, eyes full but dry. Because he needed to believe I was exactly what he thought I was. Too naive to question. Too small to fight back. If anyone knew, if even a hint of truth slipped, the plan wouldn't work. She nodded slowly. It must have been so lonely. It was, I said. For a long time it was. Across the room, Emma, an old friend who had gradually drifted into Nathan's more affluent circles, walked toward me hesitantly. She looked disoriented, almost ashamed. Julia, she began. I didn't know. The way he talked about you. I assumed. That I was exactly what he described? I asked. My voice wasn't angry, just tired. Emma flinched. I should have checked on you. I should have known better. You should have, I agreed quietly. But you didn't. And I'm not interested in patching over things to make this feel better for anyone else. Not tonight. She blinked, then nodded, accepting the honesty without protest. In the past, I would have tried to ease her discomfort. But that version of me no longer had a place at this table. Near the windows, I noticed Thomas, one of Nathan's college friends, removing contacts from his phone. He didn't care who saw. I'm out, Nathan, he said aloud to no one in particular. The Davidson contract was bad enough. But this could ruin all of us. Nathan, of course, was no longer there to hear it. The room continued to empty. The people who had once surrounded Nathan like armor were slipping away, one by one, afraid of being caught in the blast radius. I didn't blame them. Not entirely. Some had known. Others had chosen not to know. In the end, complicity and cowardice often wear the same face. Mark, my brother-in-law, approached with a fresh glass of wine and placed it gently in front of me. "You look like you could use this," he said. "And for what it's worth, I always knew you were the smartest person in any room." I offered a faint smile. "And yet you never said anything." He nodded. "I convinced myself it wasn't my place. I was wrong." The honesty stung. But it was welcome. And then Nathan's phone rang. A sharp, urgent ringtone, the one he reserved only for his executive assistant. Everyone near the table froze. He wasn't here to answer it, but the name flashing on the screen was visible. I leaned and listened. "What do you mean they're there now?" a frantic voice cried out on speaker. "The agents? They're at the office already? Don't let them touch anything." "Nothing. I'm on my way." The call ended. Silence fell again. Then movement, quick and panicked. Two more of Nathan's associates excused themselves without a word, heading straight for the exit. I didn't stop them. I didn't need to. For the first time since I met him, Nathan Coleman looked truly lost. And though he was no longer in the room, his world continued to unravel in his absence. He had spent years building a reputation on dominance and manipulation. Tonight all of it collapsed, publicly, irreversibly. The restaurant manager returned, looking uncomfortable. "Mrs. Coleman," he began, "there are some men outside asking for Mr. Coleman. They say it's urgent." I nodded. "He won't be returning." 3 men in dark suits entered. Not agents this time, federal investigators from another division. One held a document folder. Another carried a laptop. They asked for me by name. I stood, greeted them calmly, and gestured toward the head of the table. "Let's sit," I said. "I can answer your questions." I was no longer the accessory to someone else's story. I was the key witness. The architect. The woman who had spent 5 years gathering truth in silence. And now I would speak it, clearly, completely. No one would interrupt. Not anymore. 2 months later, the lecture hall at Riverside Community College buzzed with energy. Students were mid-discussion, arguing over symbolism in The Great Gatsby. I stood at the front of the room, leaning slightly against the desk, watching as their ideas unfolded. Some argued Daisy loved Gatsby for who he was. Others insisted it was about the illusion of wealth. They cited passages, challenged each other, asked deeper questions. This was what I loved. Not just literature, but the way it taught people to think, to notice, to read between the lines. "Dr. Wilson?" a student in the back called out, using the maiden name I had reclaimed. "Yes, Amber. What do you think? Did Daisy really love him? Or just what he represented?" I smiled. "That's the question, isn't it? What does the text tell us about real connection versus the performance of love?" The class leaned in. They weren't here for gossip. They didn't know the full story. Some might have heard rumors, snippets about an arrest, a dinner party, a wealthy man undone. But to them I was just their professor. A woman who asked hard questions and expected thoughtful answers. And that was enough. After class, I gathered my notes and walked across campus to the coffee shop near the student union. Every Thursday I hosted a small gathering there, a financial literacy circle for women. What had started as casual advice sessions had grown into something structured. We discussed credit scores, compound interest, legal red flags in relationships, how to recognize manipulation dressed as charm. The women who came were of all ages. Some were barely out of high school. Others were returning to school after divorce or job loss. Some came to learn. Others to unlearn. I didn't need them to know my backstory. Just the tools. That afternoon, as I set down my materials, my phone buzzed with a text from my publisher. They'd confirmed our meeting for the following week to finalize the manuscript of my first book, Hidden in Plain Sight, A Woman's Guide to Financial Self-Defense. The advance wasn't large, but the interest was already strong. Women's groups were reaching out. Book clubs. Legal clinics. It was more than I'd hoped for, but exactly what I had built it for. Outside the window someone stood watching. At first I didn't recognize her. Then she stepped closer. Vanessa. She hovered just outside the threshold, fidgeting with the strap of her purse. Her expression wasn't defiant. It wasn't even apologetic. It was uncertain. worn down, and honest. I stepped out to meet her before she lost her nerve. "I saw the flyer," she said. "About your financial literacy group. I wasn't sure if—" She trailed off. Couldn't meet my eyes. In the past I would have folded in moments like this. Offered comfort. Smoothed the edges. But the woman who had sat silently for 5 years was no longer in charge. Instead I asked, "Do you want to learn?" She nodded. "I do." "Then come in," I said. "The group is open to any woman who wants to understand her power. No one starts perfect. What matters is showing up." Vanessa didn't cry. I didn't forgive her. We weren't there for that. Inside, the women were already gathering. Laptops open. Notebooks ready. I walked back in and placed my materials at the center of the table. Vanessa took a seat at the far end. Quiet. Focused. I caught my reflection in the glass. Shoulders back, head high, no trace of the woman who used to fold herself into corners to avoid conflict. Nathan's trial was months away. The federal case would stretch on, full of hearings, subpoenas, and testimonies. But that wasn't my story anymore. It was just a consequence of his. Mine was different. Mine had already begun. Because I wasn't just surviving. I was building. Not from what he left behind, but from what he never managed to take. And as I looked around the table at the women who came to learn, I opened my notebook to a fresh, clean page and said, "Let's begin." I had once been the quiet character in someone else's narrative. The one who blended into the background while the protagonist took the spotlight. But not anymore. This was my story now. And I didn't need permission to tell it. Sometimes the most powerful transformation begins in silence. Julia's journey wasn't born from revenge. It was born from clarity, from reclaiming a voice that had been dismissed for far too long. She didn't fight with noise. She fought with patience, precision, and truth. And in doing so, she reminded us all that strength isn't always loud. It's steady, it's observant, and when the moment is right, it changes everything. What would you have done in Julia's place? Would you have waited, exposed the truth publicly, or walked away quietly? Let us know in the comments below. If this story moved you or gave you something to think about, don't forget to like, share it with someone who needs it, and subscribe to the channel for more true stories that empower, inspire, and remind us what resilience really looks like.